Okay, thanks. We'll get started now, given it's 12:31. I'm Suzanne Dyer and I'm going to be chairing today. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the next in the series of seminars that we're putting on through the Prevention of Falls-Related Injuries Centre for Research Excellence. I'd like to start first today by acknowledging that I'm hosting this meeting from the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, the traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Now, our speaker today is a Chief Investigator at the Falls CRE, Professor Terry Haines, and I'd like to welcome him. He's Head of School at the School of Primary and Allied Healthcare at Monash University, after previously being Director of Monash Health and Monash University Allied Health Research Unit. He has particular research focus in the areas of falls prevention, implementation science, and translation of evidence into policy and practice. So I'd like to hand over to Terry now. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Sue, and I'd like to acknowledge also the Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, in that I'm coming to you from the Bunurong and Bunurong lands. Well, the stepped wedge design is something that I've been asked to talk about today, and when I would use it and share some of the insights and some of the thought processes that I go through in trying to pick a study design and when the stepped wedge design is the one to be used. So I'll go through some slides with you today and share my thoughts. Now, I'm not going to profess that I have a comprehensive list here. I think there are some times and some circumstances where things come up that catch me off guard and think, oh, never thought about that before. But sometimes they're the most fun and fascinating conversations that I have in coming up with research designs for different situations. So the list as it currently stands is what I'll be presenting to you today. Just confirming that my slides are now showing on screen appropriately. They're all good? Okay. I'd like to start things off in a very simple way. Research is usually pretty simple. Most of the time, we're interested in understanding cause and effect. However, this is a remarkably complicated thing when you dig beneath the surface. Causation and causality. There's not actually one definition of causation and causality. There's a whole stream of theory and debate and philosophy over what causation actually means. I tend to use what we see at the bottom of the screen here, the counterfactual causes styles of definitions, where we are looking at one case and a counter case or a counterfactual and look at the difference between these two things. So I'm going to use that word counterfactual a little bit in the opening of today's presentation. And I do so because the issue of causality, one of the most seminal pieces of work that you'll ever find is the Bradford Hill paper. The Bradford Hill paper is not actually a paper, it's a speech. It's a transcript of a speech given by Sir Austin Bradford Hill, who did a lot of the seminal work in trying to establish the links between smoking and cancer. And Professor Bradford Hill did this presentation and has been, his criteria of causality have been named after this seminal speech, but there is a transcript of it in this journal. Now, I'll recognise at the outset that Sir Bradford Hill actually himself didn't want to get into the whole debate about what causality actually means. So he is predicating this whole concept of causality on a definition that he didn't want to enter into a debate over. Now, there are 9 criteria of causality, and experimentation is one that Bradford Hill did highlight as being here, and I quote here, the strongest support for the causation hypothesis may be revealed. So Bradford Hill was a big fan of experimentation for being able to help establish causality. However, I will put the caveat in that it wasn't a be-all and end-all in Bradford Hill's view. Austin Bradford Hill said that none of my 9 viewpoints can bring indisputable evidence for or against the cause and effect hypothesis, and none can be required to be sufficient. So there is still an element of uncertainty, even from the seminal authors in this style of research philosophy. Now, the counterfactual, I'll come back to that word, the counterfactual. How does the outcome of the test treatment, the treatment we're interested in, what we're going to call the factual, compared to what would have happened if patients had not received the test treatment, or if they had received a different treatment known to be effective? And this is what we're referring to as the counterfactual. So the control condition or the alternate treatment condition. Now, this question can be asked for both individuals and groups. For an individual, a clinician says, well, what would I do if I treated this patient with this particular treatment? What would happen if I didn't give them that particular treatment? Now, this particular concept has been long wrestled with. The statue here is of Socrates, and Socrates is reputed to have advised a young man once who asked him, when getting married, should he, or whether he should get married, do as you wish. You will likely regret no matter what you choose. And the proposition being put to Socrates here is very much about the factual and the counterfactual. What will happen if I get married? What will happen if I don't get married? And from a popular culture perspective, I think this issue is dealt with best in the movie Groundhog Day, which is one of my favorites, where a person can relive the same day, the same conditions over and over again, and experience the different outcomes that come about from making different choices. So Groundhog Day, thoroughly recommend it. Now, we get to the issue of experimentation. Experimentation to generate effect estimates. Now, there are 2 effect estimates that you might be interested in as a clinician. An individual causal effect, so the effect of a treatment on an individual person. Now, individual effects, we can never actually know. They're not identifiable, only because a person can only ever be exposed in one particular situation to the one treatment. However, the average causal effect we can estimate. And this is the difference between the mean factual outcome, so what we see in our experimental group, versus what would have been observed if all members of that population received the control, which is what we use the control group to generate that mean counterfactual outcome. So we look at the difference between those two to estimate the average causal effect. Now, we use randomized trials to estimate these average causal effects. We sample from the population, we allocate some at random to a treatment, allocate some at random to a control, and theoretically, with repeated sampling, the average observed outcome in each group would equal the average counterfactual outcome. And thus, we can calculate the average causal effects. And we use statistics and confidence intervals to estimate the uncertainty that we have in those average causal effects. So, that being said, when I think about, first and foremost, whether I need to be using a stepped wedge design, I first consider what level of evidence is required. So it's not just about a stepped wedge. Do I need to use a randomized controlled trial at all? Now, one of the things that always makes me sit back and chuckle to myself is that I've spent so many years of my life doing so many randomized controlled trials. And you know what, to be honest, and I feel like I've had limited impact on policy. And I find policy really hard to change, despite all the randomized controlled trials I do. I find it terribly frustrating. And then came along this little project that we did, guardianship in hospitals. There used to be a state of play in Victoria where if you are on the waiting list to receive guardianship and you were in a hospital bed, you sat on the same waiting list as people from the community. You could not jump the queue. There was a long queue. And if you needed guardianship sorted out, you had to wait in turn. And that was a policy of the Victorian Department of Justice. I was involved in a pre-post project, basically a pre-post project, no randomization at all, across 3 health services. And I've got the results of that little project up on screen here. And really what we did was we allowed hospitals to employ their own guardianship staff and to process hospital guardianship patients as soon as they could get that process, so they didn't have to wait in queue. And what we found is we could reduce length of stay from 46 to 22 days for the time that it takes a guardianship order to be lodged. The overall length of stay decreased from 163 days to 148 days. Basically, we saved about $5 for every $1 we spent on employing hospital-based guardians. The Department of Justice in Victoria, on this evidence alone, changed their policy. So I didn't need to do a randomized controlled trial. The stakeholder involved was quite happy for a lower level of evidence to be used to be able to get the universe of outcome that I was seeking to try and attain. So let's assume a randomized trial is required. Consideration number 2, should I use a cluster randomized approach? Well, the first consideration is, does it make sense to allocate groups in clusters rather than individuals to interventions? Now, clustering can come about in both sampling and allocation. Where there are naturally occurring groups, it often makes sense to recruit in groups. It might be GP practices, it might be residential aged care facilities, it might be hospital wards, for example. Often you can do both. Often you can recruit and randomize in clusters, but also you could do it as at an individual person level as well. So you have a choice there. And quite often it's very much a sense-making exercise in trying to figure out what makes more sense. I've got a couple of examples that I want to raise with you here. These are now some older trials now. These are the 2 of the first hospital-based falls prevention trials that reported reductions in falls in the hospital setting. One done by myself and one done by Francis Healy. And we used 2 different approaches here. The Francis Healy study was conducted across 8 wards, so 8 clusters, and they divided them into matched pairs, 4 in the intervention, 4 in the control. Whereas the study that I conducted, there was 3 wards that I had access to at the Peter James Centre in Victoria, and I used individual randomization in that particular study. Now, it's interesting to read the rationale that was used by Francis Healy in the second sentence that you see in the design paragraph, and I'll read it out. Group randomization was used as it would be unreasonable to expect staff to refrain from applying their knowledge of the intervention to individual patients within a particular ward. So one of the things that Francis is raising there is the risk of contamination between the intervention and the control group. And that risk is very real. For her intervention, she was upskilling staff and giving them procedures to implement a range of falls prevention actions. Whereas in the trial that I was running, I had staff that were separate to the ward staff delivering interventions. So it was possible for me to be able to restrict the contamination effect of that. Consideration number 3, how much resourcing do you have and need for recruitment? So I'll return back to those 2 examples. Francis's study on the left and my study on the right. And what you can see there is the number of patients in each study and the number of occupied bed days on the left. You can see the number of participants and the number of participant days in the consort flowchart in the study on the right. And what you can see is in both of these studies, there's a different number of patients involved. Across the 3 wards, there was about 1,040 patients that went through those wards over about a 12-month period. In Francis Healy's study, there was about 3,200 or so patients that went through the 8 wards over a 12-month period in Francis's study. Now, what you can see here is the sample size got much larger over the same sort of period of time, because Frances was able to do her study across more wards. And with the cluster randomization, what you tend to see is larger sample sizes being recruited more easily. And one of the things that we were doing, we were having to go around and individually ask patients whether they wanted to participate in our study or not. And what you can see at the top of the consult flow chart is that 367 people told us, no, we don't want to be a part of your study. So there's that rejection rate. So I'm starting to lose part of the sample in an individually randomized trial, whereas in the cluster randomized trial, Frances wasn't required to get individual level consent. So she was recruiting all the patients that went through the wards over that time period. Consideration 4, who's paying for the intervention and how much money do you have available? So similar to the recruitment issue, I needed staffing. I need to spend money on people getting consent. Both myself and research personnel had to get consents from patients to be a part of that study. Whereas for Frances' study, they didn't need to get those consents. In this case, for the intervention in Frances' study, if we have a look here at the table on the left, they were primarily nursing interventions being provided by the existing nursing staff. So Frances didn't need to have a research grant per se to provide the intervention here. This was a change of procedures and change of practices from the staff. Whereas, as you can see on the right-hand side in my study, I had hip protectors I had to fund. I had an education program that I had an occupational therapist going around and providing, had an exercise program that a physiotherapist was providing on top of usual care. So all of them were funded through a grant that the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services had provided to us. Consideration number 5. Numbers 2 and 3 and the relative costs, they're very much based on how many people I need to recruit in order to get statistical power to find a difference between my groups. So what you can see here on this slide is that this is from, I think it's the earlier Cochrane review, this particular one, where we've got the effect estimates and the 95% confidence interval related to the rate of falls outcome. See the Haines study 2004 there, and the Healy study 2004. Now, what you'll see here is that the confidence intervals around the Haines study are actually much narrower than what you see around the Healy study, even though the Healy study had a much larger number of patients involved. And this is because there was need to adjust for the cluster randomized design that the Healy study used. And this was done by Sue in the most recent update as a part of the Cochrane review process. So the data that you'll see in the Healy study, they didn't actually do the adjustment for cluster randomization in that study. So you need to look at the Cochrane review to see an adjustment being applied. Now, if you want to apply a cluster randomized design and understand its impact on statistical power, basically you can calculate the power you need for a RCT with standard individual randomization of participants, and then multiply this by a variance inflation factor, or also known as a design effect. And the formula for that is on screen. And it relates to the number of participants in each cluster and the intra-cluster correlation coefficient. Now, the impact of cluster size in a cluster randomized controlled trial, it's important to note that as your number of clusters increases, the number of people you need in each cluster reduces. So there's this reciprocal relationship going on here, and vice versa. So if you've only got a small number of clusters available, you actually need a very large amount of sample size. And it can get to the point where increasing your sample size in terms of the number of people per cluster stops providing you with any additional statistical power. So there are some ceiling effects that take place in these calculations. A further thing to think about is the impact of that intra-cluster correlation coefficient. That design effect, what you multiply the standard sample size calculation for in order to get a cluster randomized controlled trial calculation, if that ICC goes up to about 0.3, as you can see down the bottom here, for a mean cluster size experiment, which is similar to what the Healy study was, then you're basically multiplying your sample size requirement by 75 if that ICC is 0.3. If it's down at the 0.0001 level, then it's only making a very, very small effect. You're only multiplying that sample size by 1.025. So that ICC and the decision as to whether you use cluster randomization or not can be critical because it can really dramatically escalate your sample size requirements. Key consideration 6, the risk of bias and imbalance between groups in a cluster trial. Now, a lot of people have the misunderstanding that if you have a larger sample size, you're less likely to find a significant difference in your baseline characteristics. But that's not the case because you're setting your alpha rate, your type 1 error rate at a similar amount, regardless of what comparison you're looking at. What you are doing, in fact, though, is helping to reduce the magnitude of differences to be smaller and less likely to be a source of bias. So the presence or absence of a significant difference in baseline characteristics is not a good indicator of imbalance between groups that is meaningful. So the cluster randomized controlled trial, even though it gets larger sample sizes, it doesn't necessarily provide you with protection overall, because in addition to the patient level issues, you're also dealing with problems related to the patient's exposure to background care being different and the reliability and validity of measurements if you're relying on measurements that are being done within the cluster, that they may be different between groups. So if we go back to Francis Healy's study, for example, if they were just looking at the post-intervention intervention wards versus the control wards, with only 4 wards per group, then there's a high risk that a ward that has very poor care might unevenly be balanced in one group compared to another group, or that a ward that has high levels of baseline fall rates goes in one group or the other. Now, what Frances did to mitigate that risk was to have a pre-intervention period of 6 months that she looked at, and to try and account for the baseline levels of fall rates between those different wards. But the issue of validity and reliability of reporting as well is something that shouldn't be ignored in the falls prevention area, because I did some work back in Queensland where we found that the attitudes to reporting falls was actually quite different between different types of wards. And you can see the results from this particular paper on screen. Respondents working on acute neuro or brain injury rehab wards were less likely to classify descents onto surfaces other than the ground as falls. Respondents working on orthopedics wards were more likely to classify assisted descents to the floor as falls. So if you've got an orthopedic ward in one arm and a neurological ward on another, based on those sort of results, you've got to be wondering, right, well, are they using the same reporting practices and approaches on those different wards if incident reports are my primary source of falls data? So now we get to the Stepped-Wedge. So we've gone through the issues related to individual randomization, randomization at all, cluster randomization, and now we get to the Stepped-Wedge. And if people want to see a couple of papers that are good introductory papers to the Stepped-Wedge, I recommend these two on screen. But basically, a Stepped-Wedge design is where you have clusters that transition from a control condition to an intervention condition at randomly allocated time points. So as we see on screen here, we have an example of 5 hospitals and 6 time periods. And that randomization process has taken place such that hospital A transitions first during period 2, then hospital B during period 3, and so on. So it is not a case of an intervention group or a control group that you are dealing with here. It is periods, a control period and an intervention period. Every cluster is exposed to both periods. Now, my first experience of a Stepped-Wedge design was one where I walked into it and didn't even realize I was doing it. It was actually a parallel cluster RCT design, very much like the study design that Francis Healy used, as exhibited in the bottom left, where I had a number of subjects into different wards. Half of those wards, so I had a pre-intervention period, which is all white. Then I randomly allocated certain wards to an intervention condition and other wards to remain in the control condition in that second period. And then at the end of the study, I gave everyone in the control wards the same intervention that I'd given to the intervention wards. The only issue is I didn't actually collect the data from this third period. If I had collected the data from that third period, I would have had a stepped wedge design on my hand. So as I've spoken previously in this forum, the stepped wedge design is to me is actually an extension and an evolution of the cluster randomized controlled trial design with pre and post control and intervention periods. So the stepped wedge design, one of the considerations that first comes to mind is about risk of bias and imbalance between groups. Similar to what I talked about before with the cluster randomized approach versus individual randomized approach. But in the stepped wedge, again, it's that characteristic of being able to account for those ward level differences. So hospital E might be a trauma hospital. Hospital D might be an aged care hospital. Those differences, if those hospitals had been allocated as clusters in a parallel randomized controlled trial, you could expect some fundamental differences in baseline care practices, in patient population, and in possibly reporting practices for falls across those different settings. Now, because in the stepped wedge design, every cluster appears in both the intervention and control period, those differences are able to be eliminated from the estimation of the effect size when you do your analysis. So for me, the stepped wedge is superior for addressing potential imbalance, particularly if the number of clusters is low. As I said earlier, for the recruitment of individuals into a randomized controlled trial, you don't ever get protection against finding significant differences. But what you do get protection against is the magnitude of those differences being substantial enough to be likely to bias the results. The same is true for the number of clusters. But again, you need large numbers of clusters in order to be starting to be confident that you're getting equivalence in baseline characteristics and reporting practices. So I'd be expecting north of 50 clusters before I'm really confident about that sort of thing. Again, there's no hard science behind those sort of numbers. This is based more so on my observation of parallel cluster RCTs that I've been involved in and some of the differences that I've observed in some of these characteristics. Key consideration number 8, acceptability. And this is a big one for me. This is about being able to get busy health services that are primarily there to provide service, being willing and accepting of a research project that can be quite disruptive at times. Being able to assure health services that, yes, you'll get the intervention eventually using a stepped wedge design, I have universally found more palatable than saying to them, you will have a 50% chance of getting the intervention. And indeed, it was that very statement and that line of reasoning that I used with the low bed study that I showed earlier, where I said, right, you'll either get the intervention for the first 6 months or at the end of the study, I'll give you all a bunch of low beds anyway, that allowed me to recruit the way I did. Next consideration. Now I've got divided this consideration, this sample size and statistical power consideration into 3 parts. So the first part of the sample size consideration is that power. On the left of the screen, I have the Francis Healy study. It's a table about participants that I showed you earlier. And also I've added table 3 on the left, which includes the number of falls in each of those periods now. On the right, I have a study by Anne-Marie Hill conducted on rehabilitation wards in Western Australia. Both of these studies had 8 wards. If you look at the table of participants on the bottom right from Anne-Marie Hill's study, you'll see that the number of participants in that study is not that much different from the number of participants in Francis Healy's study. They're in the same sort of ballpark. There was a total of 576 falls in Anne Marie Hill's study. The number of falls for Francis Healy's study in the table on the bottom left. So Francis Healy actually had more falls across the entire period. But when we look at the statistical power generated and the precision of the 95% confidence intervals, this is from the more recent Cochrane analysis. We see Anne Marie Hill's study here, 2015, and the width of those confidence intervals, and immediately above it, the Francis Healy study and the width of those confidence intervals. Now, I will highlight again that the Cochrane team had to apply an ICC to Francis Healy's study based on other studies, and it wasn't necessarily the ICC that would have come up from Francis Healy's data. We never saw what that ICC actually was from that report, so you have to use what you can. But from this, you can see, I guess, that difference that within subject comparison power advantage generates for a stepped wedge trial. Now, the next issue with sample size with the stepped wedge is that the ICC and its impact is not the same as with a parallel cluster RCT. This figure is from a paper by Wertman in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. And what they've done is that they've looked at the effect of different levels of ICC on the effect of the sample size requirements and statistical power. And what you see is, instead of almost an exponential increase in statistical power that I demonstrated earlier with the parallel cluster RCT design, in the stepped wedge, the effect of the ICC varies depending on how many steps you have and how many people in each step, but largely they're almost horizontal lines that you're seeing on screen. The ICC only has a very small effect on the statistical power calculations in a stepped wedge design. And again, this is partly because of that within subject comparison, or that within cluster comparison, which is the design characteristic of the stepped wedge. So if ICC is a worry for you for a parallel cluster RCT, have a look at what it might do in a stepped wedge, because it may not be as diabolical if your ICCs are on the high side. Now, I will highlight here the final consideration under the statistical sample size considerations. There is some debate out there. You will find some debate. And if you follow this article, again, Carla Hemming, who I've collaborated with quite a bit, responded to a paper where there was an assertion that the stepped wedge always had lower sample size requirements and was always more efficient. And in this paper, Carla Hemming identified a couple of things. One, well, efficiency you can consider from the point of view of how many measurements you have to take and how much it costs to run a trial, not just sample size, but also gave an example where sample size could be lower in a parallel cluster RCT as opposed to the stepped wedge. So you can get some examples that you generate. It's not a universal law that the parallel RCT will always be lower. Consideration number 10, the effect of confounding of time and interactions across clusters. One of the things that the stepped wedge is vulnerable to is if there is variation over time that will affect some clusters more than others. Now, variation over time that affects all clusters equally just gets washed out in the analysis, because you normally include a variable for each time period in that analysis. But if it's an interaction between time period and cluster, then it's potentially problematic. So let's say, for example, here, hospital E is particularly subject to the winter flu season, whereas hospitals A, B, C, and D are not. And that hospital flu season kicks in the middle of periods 3 and 4, for example. That will load onto the routine care arm in this particular trial, whatever effect that is, good or bad. It will look like that's in the control arm, unless it's unless it's observed in hospitals A and B, who are also in the intervention arm during those times. So interaction effects between clusters and time is something you need to think about, and whether it's a realistic possibility of being a confounder in your trial. Consideration number 11, feasibility. Got a couple of trials here on screen. The first one, the top one, was the trial of weekend allied health services on acute medical and surgical wards. We conducted this trial, this Stepped-Wedge trial. It's actually 2 Stepped-Wedge trials run back to back. And you can see that on the right-hand side here of the screen. One of the things that you'll notice is that in trial 2 at the Footscray site, we're missing a ward in the second part of the trial. And because we're missing a ward there, we're also missing one period at the end. It's actually shorter, the length of that trial. What happened was the trial, the ward was closed down. It had, so to speak, concrete cancer in the physical construction of the ward, and they had to close it down in a way that was not anticipated by the study investigators. And we just had to remove it from the trial. There's nothing we could do. They moved the patients out and they started bulldozing things. So that was problematic. It's problematic particularly for Stepped-Wedge trials, more so than parallel cluster randomized controlled trials. With a parallel cluster randomized controlled trial, it doesn't really impact anything beyond the individual unit. Whereas in the Stepped-Wedge trial, we did lose that whole time period of valuable data at the end, because we went from having, 6 steps to having only 5 steps in the design. The Stepped-Wedge trials also require you to give that intervention on the specific time when it's due. In the bottom left on this screen, you'll see it's a feasibility pilot protocol that Satyan Chari, one of my PhD students, did as a part of his PhD. And in that pilot trial, what we were trying to do was introduce strip lighting to the bathroom areas of hospital wards and around toilets and around the sinks. And the limitation we came up with the feasibility in that trial was that the engineering department at the hospital he was working at couldn't guarantee that they would actually be able to get the job done at the time that it required to be done with a Stepped-Wedge design. So it would actually be a better intervention to evaluate with a parallel cluster randomized controlled trial, because you can always do parallel cluster randomized trials with a staggered start date. You don't have to start everything on the same date. What I would advise is that people have pairs of intervention and control wards that they commence at the same time, but you don't have to start everything on January 1st, so to speak. Whereas with a Stepped-Wedge design, that is an essential feature. You are bound to the timing that the design imposes. And if all of a sudden your engineering department loses 3 staff members and they just physically can't get around and get it done, you've pretty much got junky data. Final consideration, and this is where I'm actually going to introduce a variation to the Stepped-Wedge design. Am I interested in timing of an intervention? This might be something that I could use a Stepped-Wedge for. In this study, this is a study that we've published recently looking at 12-month weight loss interventions in adults with obstructive sleep apnea. What we wanted to do was start a dietary lifestyle intervention in this patient group. However, the concern from clinicians was that, well, these patients, they get overloaded early on. They're getting their diagnosis, they're getting used to a CPAP machine, they're having to change their sleeping patterns and lifestyle, and then we want to throw a diet and exercise regime in on top of that. Would we be better just dealing with the CPAP machine first and that sort of thing, and leaving a bit of time before we then start them up on the lifestyle intervention? Now, the trial design that we used here for this situation was that everyone started their entry to the trial when they got diagnosed and commenced their CPAP. So that's when people entered in at time 0. They were then randomly allocated to a period of delay, either 1 month, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 months delay to start the lifestyle intervention. We did uniform weight measures every month on every patient, and we actually continued them on. So on the left-hand side of this figure here, we actually have that stepped wedge design that is classical. Whoop, back, sorry. That classical stepped wedge design here. But what we did is we actually then followed up for longer, and we gave that intervention for 6 months for each person. So we had then a combination of designs in place here. We had a stepped wedge. If you look at the outcome measures captured monthly up until the end of month 6, up to the end of month 7, we had a interrupted baseline time series design with a final outcome assessment at time point 12. And we had a 6-group timing of intervention study going on simultaneously. So we had multiple analyses. So overall, we found that the intervention was very good for reducing body weight, but that it didn't actually matter when you started it, when you finished that intervention. And that those gains that were made were primarily made in the first couple of months of commencing that intervention, and then started to plateau off afterwards. So on the right-hand side, you see the time transition relative graph that we've thought up for the stepped wedge design being displayed here across the entire study period for those 6 timing of commencement groups. The other feature that's interesting with this particular design is it's a stepped wedge with individual randomization. Individuals were randomized to groups here. And the groups were only groups in as much as that's the duration of time they had to wait to start the lifestyle intervention. So we only needed just over 60, I think it was around 60 patients in this study, and had quite a sizable amount of statistical power, which was an interesting feature of this design. So I found this one a fascinating one from a purely methodological perspective, let alone the clinical intervention in the population we're looking at. So I've been going for a bit of time now, but I think it might be valuable if we did open up to questions that people might have and thoughts and their experiences of trying to select between stepped wedge and other designs to answer their particular questions.
Thanks so much, Terry. I was just going to add, I should have mentioned this at the start. This is the second seminar that Terry has given for those who missed it on stepped wedge design in our seminar series, but you can view a recording of the first one without the entertainment and interruptions. There is a link on the invitation to today's seminar, I think on the full CRE website, and also on the email invitation. So I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions for Terry.
I think Maureen might be waving in.
Yeah, hi Terry. Sorry, I just had a question about how you work out the ICC. I might have missed it on that slide, but how do you choose, or do you have to have prior data or?
Yeah, so prior data is great, particularly from the wards that you're going to be recruiting and collecting data from, if you can get it. If you can't get it, then there are a number of trials out there now in falls prevention that have published ICCs, which you might be able to say, oh, our population looks similar to that sort of population. I think their ICC might approximate our population quite well. It is a bit of a black art, though, when you get to that sort of level, because even amongst a group of rehabilitation wards, there are some wards that might be loaded with neuro patients and other wards loaded with elective joint replacement surgery. If any of them still get to go to rehabilitation these days, I think they'll get sent home. But you can still get quite a bit of variety in ward types, and wards that tend to cluster and group their similar sorts of patients together. If you've got wards like that, then your chances of getting a higher ICC are greater. Whereas wards where they just distribute, a few stroke patients here, a few there, a few deconditioning patients here and there, they tend to have lower ICCs because the variability within the ward is similar to the variability between the wards, which is what the ICC is really based on.
Thanks, Terry. I'll just add that Sandra has put a link to the first seminar that Terry did in the chat, if anyone wants to grab that now. And Christine Lynn has a question.
Thanks, Terry. So I've done a few trials, but not in a cluster randomized or step-wedge design setting. And I was just going to ask you, I'm trying to design a trial at the moment in which we want to implement a policy across different hospitals and assess the effects before, between implementation versus no implementation. And we've been trying to decide between the cluster randomized design and the step-wedge design. And sample size consideration aside, to my mind, the advantage of having a step-wedge is each hospital acts as effectively as its own control. So you sort of overcome some of the practice variation that could exist between hospitals. But I guess my concerns about a step-wedge design is, one, does that mean that because you need to obviously allow you need to allow each site to complete the intervention period. So does that drag out the length of time for the trial longer, rather than, like being able to randomize the groups in a parallel situation?
Yeah.
And the second one is in your example of, that a ward dropped out because of, reasons beyond your control. What can you do in that instance when you've already generated a randomization list?
Yeah. All right. So for the first one, there's a couple of ways. Parallel cluster RCTs, you can still use that pre-intervention control period to help generate some control data. It's not as good because it's still very susceptible to variation over time, that sort of thing. And you always want to be careful about pre-intervention control periods being pre-specified in the trial protocol and done before the trial protocols are registered. Because some people, I'm going to do a PhD one day, or get a PhD student one day to go back through all the historical control periods and try to find out what governed the timing of when they finished and when they started, because I think there's some influence there on the results. So like the Francis Healy study, like the low bed study I did, you can use those pre-intervention periods to get some control for a parallel cluster ICT. You are right. The Stepped-Wedge probably does it better, and that is my feeling. The risk of contamination between sites. Do you have staff moving between sites who will be exposed to the intervention at one site at one time, and then go and work at a site that shouldn't have the intervention yet they're going to carry that little infection, so to speak, to that site potentially. That's another consideration you might want to think about. So you start thinking about the geography of the different sites you've got and whether they're dispersed enough and whether they share staffing. Sometimes more of a problem on wards within a hospital than between hospitals, but you do get people who work for one health service and another on the weekends or that sort of thing from time to time. So sorry, what was the second part?
I guess it's just about the length of time consideration when you do a step-wedge trial versus a parallel.
Usually the step-wedge starts to will take longer depending on how you design it, but not always. Not always. It's really about the sample size considerations you've got and how much you want to allow for, I guess, a wash-in effect. So sometimes interventions have a bit of a wash-in effect. In a stepped-wedge design, you might want to throw in an extra period between the control and intervention period that you black out in terms of your analysis. That extends the trial time. But as long as you pre-specify that and that you're not using that first transition period of data, I don't think there is a problem with that. But again, it can make it go for a bit longer. But really, you'll need some advice about statistical power and how to get an equivalent amount of statistical power from a parallel versus a stepped wedge for your given context to know exactly how much difference in time there might be. There may be none.
And my final question was, in the example you gave, that particular ward had to drop out.
Yes.
They couldn't continue.
Oh, yes.
What do you normally do when you have multiple sites and they're all lined up?
I hold my breath for as long as I can and hope and pray that nothing bad happens. And that's a risk you take. That is the risk you take. I've got one Stepped-Wedge trial at the moment that we're only just almost about to activate, and we've delayed that because of COVID for 18 months or 2 years now almost. And it is just something that there's been another Stepped-Wedge. Oh, no, not another Stepped-Wedge. There's been a parallel cluster RCT that's taken place at those sites I'm aware of in a similar sort of field. The problem with my design as well is it's a disinvestment trial. And sometimes it's harder to take things away from people than to have something added on top. So that might also be a reason why the sites have been a bit reluctant to get started. But yeah, the Stepped-Wedge, I do find you want to have nice settled seas before you go sailing and hope that the stormy weather doesn't come and strike your ship down in the middle of the night.
Thanks for that poetic ending.
I think Leanne has a question.
Thanks, Terry. That was great. I would love to do a Stepped-Wedge trial, as Kathy knows, but the type of data that we need is not routinely collected. And I wonder, have you had any experience before in trying to embed some measures in with clinicians to get it happening before you actually start a Stepped-Wedge trial, or give up?
You've struck on a key issue here. So the Stepped-Wedge trial that we did with the weight loss and the obstructive sleep apnea, there was that was just weight measures that we added in, and we were able to get that feasibly done. It cost a bit of money, but it was possible. We were able to do it. It very much depends on the context that you're working with. I tend to try and avoid adding in additional data collection. I will make my primary outcomes very much based on routinely collected data. But if I do have need to capture data, things like, patient satisfaction with care on the ward, for example, not routinely collected, but if I want some of that, what I tend to build into my proposals is that we have randomly selected days where people being discharged that day or the next day, we just go and get a sample of those patients to supplement the routinely collected data with some stuff that might be require individual patient level consent and individual collection of data that's not as, there's a little bit more research burden, but just to help fill out that picture, because if you're just relying on what's routinely collected, sometimes there's some important pieces of the puzzle that you don't get. So it is difficult though, because it's a whole practice change activity you need to do even before you start your trial that you're talking about.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, we have a query online, Terry. The slides will become available through the full CRE website. Is that right, Sandra, Terry?
If the recording goes up, I guess the slides will be there.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can send them through.
Kathy has a question.
Thank you so much, Terry. That was so clear. I had a question about cluster trials and matching. So you said that it would make sense to start intervention and control wards, like have pairs where you've got one intervention and one control at the same time. But are you talking about actually matching and then randomizing, or are you talking about using a different approach to randomization, but just actually starting one of each so that you can help control for time a little bit?
Yes, so I was referring to that with the staggered starting dates with the parallel cluster RCT. And the reason that I would suggest matching in that circumstance is so that you have equivalent exposure to time between the intervention and control periods. And again, it's things like flu season and all that sort of thing that typically are things that I worry about with hospital-based research, that you are treating the intervention and control group fairly. Now, you can theoretically do it both ways. You can match into pairs and then randomly split them. And that's something that I have proposed with the multi-group Stepped-Wedge design that I mentioned briefly. And that's the nature of the disinvestment trial we're doing, where we have a two-stage randomization. So we put the wards into pairs first. We randomize those pairs to starting positions in the stepped wedge. But then at the point of transition, we use dynamic randomization based on the control period falls data, so that if one group that we're randomizing into has had more falls in the baseline period, then the one of the pair that's got more falls gets randomized to the other group. So it's a version of Frayn's randomization approach, dynamic randomization approach. And that's a nice little nuance that we built into the multi-group stepped wedge disinvestment design that we're pursuing.
Interesting. Thank you. Is that a version of minimization then?
Yes. So minimization is another term that's used for the dynamic randomization strategy, I think. So there's a few different terminologies out there, but I think you're correct with that terminology.
I can't see any more questions alive, so perhaps I'll get in a really quick one, which is, you mentioned, Terry, how in recruiting wards you found the stepped wedge approach, more appealing for recruitment because everyone gets the intervention. Have you encountered a situation where hospital wards or hospitals you're involved in simply want to implement a change and you're trying to convince them to do a stepped wedge trial to collect the data? And how do you go about that?
Yes. Oh, if only I could slow people in healthcare down. If I could just slow them down and just go, right, I know you want to change things, but if we do this slower, we can do it better. And we can understand whether it works or not if we just slow down. That is something that has gone through my mind so many times. So it's a very important point. The stepped wedge, if people are keen to just do it, then, they can. If they want to do it and they have the resources to do it, then you can't stop them. You can only maybe illustrate, but wouldn't it be a shame, though, if in 12 months' time and more research comes out and that says it's not a good thing, because the proposition you're putting here is that people are trying to translate before the evidence is being generated. And wouldn't it be a shame that this thing that you think is really good has to be removed again because somebody else comes out with a trial that's at a different site, a different sort of patients to yours, but the guidelines will then be influenced and this, that, the other. So I try to point to the future picture of what could happen to try and slow them down and to try and highlight, you've got this one opportunity before we go live with this to do it right and to make this a benefit, not only just for this health service and this health service now and in the future, but for other health services. Because there is a big risk that, if you just go sailing ahead, that, things might not be as sunny in 12 months' time. And you could be in a sticky situation where you're then doing something which doesn't have an evidence base and people are calling it into question. I don't know how compelling that argument is.
I think I agree. It's harder to undo things than to do things sometimes. Well, that was a brilliant overview of the considerations to undertake when you're thinking about putting a stepped wedge trial or running a stepped wedge trial. So thank you very much. I don't think we have any more questions and we're at the end of our time limit. So thank you again. And yes, I believe the talk and with the slides will be uploaded onto the full CRE site. So thank you very much, everyone.
See you later, everyone.
And thanks, Terry.